tonight I wanted to talk about a word that many of us are acquainted with, but I want to look at this particular word in the halachic dictionary in a little bit more depth than we usually do. And we're all acquainted with the idea that every language has certain words that are particular to it and that are very hard to translate. And when you find these special untranslatable words, they actually turn out to tell you something very deep about the culture that uses the language that has that word in it. Okay, so for example, famously, there's a word in German, I don't speak German, but famously there's a word in German, Schadenfreude, which means the pleasure that's derived from another person's misfortune or failure. So that's a horrible word. It's a terrible word, but it's actually a word that has a lot of meaning packed into it, right? In one word, you get all of that meaning. And it tells you something unusual about a culture that would even need a word that captures so much meaning. Again, the pleasure derived from another person's misfortune. So that's kind of on a sad note. On a happier note, or a more interesting, positive note, another example, in Japanese, apparently there's a word komorebi, which means the way that sunshine shines through the leaves of trees. So if you're in a forest and you see the beauty of sunlight going through the leaves, there's a special Japanese word just for that. Also, that's an amazing word. It captures so much, and it tells you something about the culture of the Japanese and their attention to detail and love of nature. And so in our Jewish experience, we can easily think of words that are unique to the way that we speak and that reflect our way of living. And these words would be words like chutzpah or tachlis, or what, there's a list of these words, and they're fantastic words, and you couldn't use any English word to replace them. So, okay, so tonight, the word that I want to spend some time on is, the star of the show is the word bedieved. Okay, so bedieved, the halachic term, I want to argue tonight that it's actually one of the most important words in all of Judaism, okay? And it's a word that we're aware of, but again, I want to go into it into maybe a little bit more depth than usual. So instead of trying to just translate it off the bat, because I think bedieved is a hard word to translate, let's just go through some examples. Let me see if I can pull up a source sheet. Okay, hopefully you can see this. Okay, so you can see it. Okay, great, thanks. So let's start. So in the Shulchan Aruch, these are the laws of shofar for Rosh Hashanah. It says, shofar shel Rosh Hashanah mitzvato b'shel ayil v'kafuf. So the shofar of Rosh Hashanah, the mitzvah is that it should be a ram's horn and it should be bent. Then it says, ubedieved, so that's our word, ubedieved, kol hashofrot ksherim, bein pshutim, bein kfufim. So ubedieved, and again, I'm not even going to translate it yet, but I guess make an attempt. So bedieved, after the fact, if you used something that did not meet the requirements of the first line, right? It was not a ram's horn or it was not bent, then kol hashofrot ksherim. Then all shofrot are actually kosher. Bein pshutim, bein kfufim, whether they are straight or curved. Mitzvah b'kfufim yoter mib'pshutim, but it's better to use a bent one than a curved one than a bent one. The shel para pasul, but it shouldn't be from cattle. The whole gavna in any case. And you can't use antlers. Okay, so just to unpack it, right? We start out simply. The mitzvah is to use a bent ram's horn. That's what you're supposed to do. But what if you did something that didn't meet those criteria? Do you need to start over? Have you accomplished anything? Have you fulfilled your obligation? So we say bedieved, after the fact, it doesn't have to be actually from a ram's horn, and it doesn't actually have to be bent. Okay, so that's example one. Okay, so example two. This is the laws of the reading of the Megillah, of Megillat Esther. So say tzarich lomar aseret bnei Haman ve'aseret hakol b'neshima achat lehodia shekulam nehargu v'nitlu ke'echad. You're supposed to read the line that talks about the hanging of the 10 sons of Haman all in one breath. Okay, you should do it all in one shot. And then the Rama adds, gloss, he says, Haga, v'davka lechatchila. Says that is only lechatchila, another important word, right? Kind of optimally, if you were, that's how you should do it up front. That is how you were meant to do it. Aval bedieved, but again, if you did not meet that requirement after the fact, we would say, basically, it's okay. All right. So, okay. So now let me unshare for a sec. Okay. So again, this is just as background because these are words that we know, but I just want to make sure we're all kind of on the same page. So bedieved is typically defined against lechatchila, right? They're paired. Lechatchila is easy to translate, I think, easier to translate in English. It means something like ideal or optimal. Literally, it means from the beginning, but the idea is that if you're planning up front, this is what you should ideally do. Now, b'diavad literally means after the fact, but it's, I think, much harder to translate all of the meaning that's packed into it. So saying something that is okay, b'diavad, means something like this. It's acceptable after the fact, it's suboptimal, but still good enough and much, much better than not having done it at all. Okay, so that's I think that's a lot. It's a lot packed into one word. So I'm just going to say it again. So acceptable after the fact, suboptimal, but still good enough and much, much better than not having done it at all. And I'm going to argue tonight that this concept of bediavad is actually an amazing concept. It may just be the secret of Jewish success, and it's not obvious. Okay, now you may ask, why celebrate bediavad? What does that even mean? Isn't it by its nature suboptimal? Isn't it by its nature something not to be praised? And here, I think it's important to point out that the way we think about systems is different than the way we think about individuals. So if you were talking to an individual, you probably wouldn't say, you know, great job, you pulled off bediavad. Great job, you did a second-rate job. Awesome. Like, you wouldn't say that. But when we think about the whole system of halacha and kind of our culture more broadly, I think it's actually important to appreciate that we have a concept of bediavad, and that's what we're going to think about a little bit tonight. So this year is going to have three parts. First, we're going to talk about this concept of bediavad, of this is kind of the title of the shiur, acknowledging and valuing imperfection. Okay, we're going to talk about that as a general matter and its deep roots in Jewish tradition, and we'll talk about it first kind of in a more philosophical way of just the concept of bediavad. Broadly speaking. Then part two, we'll look at the word bediavad and its use, actually the history of its use. And I think that's also very interesting. And then finally, we'll use that to think a little bit about why Judaism's embrace of this concept of bediavad, I think, is so important. Like I said, maybe just the secret of Jewish success. Okay, so let's start. Part one, the concept of bediavad. So the concept of bediavad, we'll see, runs way back in our tradition. It runs extremely deep. And we'll see that over and over, our earliest sources reflect on the way that things are, and they stress that in many cases, the way things are is not ideal. Or another way to say this is that Jewish tradition makes clear that many aspects of the world that we live in are not lechatchila. They are not ideal. They can at best be described as bediavad. They're imperfect. They're suboptimal. But this is the important point. They're far better than they otherwise might be, and therefore worthy of appreciation. And I think that's an important part to keep in mind. Okay, so let's go through, we're going to go through a series of examples of places where our tradition takes something and reflects on it as being not optimal, but still important to recognize its value. So now let's call it, I'm going to call it the source sheet again. Okay, so the first topic, and this may remind some folks of a shiur that I gave actually a year ago in person at Beth Jacob. A lot of these sources were involved in a shiur that I gave about the laws of kingship and something having to do with some Jewish reflections on politics, actually. So, and the reason is that one of the first things that Tanakh makes clear is that kings are a great example of something that's bediavad. Okay, so the Tanakh was written at a time when kingship was the rule. right? And ancient Israel itself was a monarchy. But the way that Tanakh relates to kingship is quite ambivalent. And that's what we're going to look at as an example. So this ambivalence goes all the way back to the Torah itself when it talks about the laws of kingship. So let's go through that. That's in Varim, actually in Parshat Shoftim.
Josh, there's a request to make it a little bigger. If you can,
I can do that.
Zoom in a little at the top.
Let's see if I can figure that out. All right. Is that any better?
Yeah.
Okay. So there we read in Parshat Shoftim. It says, when you enter the land, when you enter the land and you take possession of it and you settle into it, and you say, Ve'amarta asima alai melech kechol hagoyim. It says, I want to put a king upon myself, like the people will say, let us put a king upon ourselves, like all of the surrounding nations have kings, right? So then it says, Som tasim alecha melech, put upon yourself a king, and it has kind of a command voice, but you should do it only in the right way. It has to be a Jewish king, and there are a whole bunch of rules as related to the king. So you see that on the one hand, it's not a great start if you're trying to justify kingship, that people say, we want to have a king just like all the people around us. That's usually not a good, usually not the best intro. But clearly the Torah is at least okay with a king, and question mark, kind of how excited the Torah is about kingship. And this plays out more really as you go into the books of Tanakh. So the next source is from the book of Shoftim, and this is early on where we hear the story of Gidon. Gidon is approached by the people after he succeeds in beating Midian, and the people come to him and they say, rule over us. It's a rule over us. Gamata, gam bincha, gam et ben bincha. So you, your children, and your children's children. So basically start a hereditary monarchy. And he says in the second pasuk, you see, he says, in V'amar alehem Gidon, lo imshol ani bachem velo yimshol b'ni bachem, Hashem yimshol bachem. So I will not rule over you, and my children will not rule over you, but God will rule over you. And that seems to be more of an ideal, right? That wouldn't it be great if there was a world where we didn't need kings, and in fact, the society could be ordered without having kingship. It would be under direct divine rule, let's say. But by the time we get to the end of the book of Shoftim, what we see is the final words, and this comes up a number of times, but the final statement of Shoftim is, Bayamim hahem ein melech b'Yisrael. Basically, everybody did as he wanted to. It was chaos without a king. So whatever the ambivalence about kingship dating back to the Torah and certainly early in the book, the kind of the final message is you need a king, or at least you need something better than not having a king and having chaos, because that is unacceptably bad. Okay, and then even more so as you kind of go, after the book of Shoftim, then you move on to the book of Shmuel, and in Shmuel, it actually comes to pass that the people come to Shmuel and they say, I'm just going to go through this, the kind of the underlined in English. They said to him, you've grown old, your sons have not followed in your ways, therefore appoint a king for us to govern us like all other nations. So Shmuel was displeased that they said, give us a king to govern us. Just basically playing out what the Torah had said would happen. Shmuel prayed to Hashem, and Hashem replied to Shmuel and said, heed the demand of the people in everything they say to you, for it is not you that they have rejected, it's me that they have rejected as their king. Now here, echoing the line that Gidon had said, that ideally God would be kind of direct rule, and here the people have rejected it, but God basically says, it's okay, it's not ideal, but you should allow this. And then Shmuel goes on to give this very long monologue where he says to the people, I'm not going to read it all, but just kind of the underlying parts will give you a sense of the message. He says, this will be the practice of the king who will rule over you. He will take your sons. He will take your daughters. He will seize your choice fields. He will take a 10th part of your grain. He will take your male and female slaves. He will take a 10th part of your flocks. Basically, the king will take and take and take, and it won't end. And you'll be sorry that you ever asked for this. Okay, so that's the tension. And so, you know, again, not to repeat the shiur that I gave a year ago, but the Torah doesn't, I would say, doesn't, you know, isn't too excited about monarchy, but is very much not excited about chaos, and seems to be in favor of at least an ordered society. And whether monarchy is the best solution, probably not, but maybe at least in its day, that was the best solution out there. Torah certainly didn't invent democracy or whatever will replace democracy. So anyways, so this is a great example, right? It's a very classic example. Kings are bediavad, we would say, right? Not ideal, but suboptimal, and again, much, much better than the alternative, and therefore worthy of being acknowledged and valued. All right, so now let's take another example, because the other examples may be more surprising. So the next example would be prophecy. So prophecy is bediavad. Okay, so this comes from the story of at Har Sinai. So the people, the revelation is going on, and it's too much for the people to handle. So this is in the book of Shemot. It says, "V'chol ha'am ro'im et hakolot v'et halapidim v'kol shofar v'et har ashan." So all of this amazing revelation is going on. And then the underlined portion, "V'yomru el Moshe daber ata imanu v'nishma'a v'ay daber imanu Elohim pen namut." They come to Moshe and say, please, we want you to be an intermediary. It's too much for us to deal directly from God. Okay, so that's a background. Why are there prophets? There are ideally, everybody should be able to receive a direct message from God, but it's too much for most people. And so b'diavad, we have a solution, which is that there are intermediaries. There are prophets who are basically intermediaries and are able to get across messages that not everybody would be able to accept and understand themselves. Okay, so that is in Shemot. And then if you kind of didn't, in Bamidbar, the point is, I would say, made even more strongly, where there's a story that Moshe is very frustrated with the people, and he cries out to God, and he says he can't handle the people alone. And God says, okay, well, gather 70 elders and they'll be your support. And actually, the Shekhinah kind of rests on these 70 elders, and they are able to receive prophecy. And then when all that's done, so then this is kind of at the bottom of the paragraph, what happens is there are these two people, Eldad and Medad, and so I'm just going to read it I'll read the English. So from verse 27, a youth ran out and told Moshe, saying, Eldad and Medad are acting as prophets in the camp. And Yoshua ben Nun, Moshe's attendant from his youth, spoke up and said, my lord, Moshe, restrain them, or even Klaim in Hebrew, put them down, right? Yeshua's like, this is terrible. How can you have these two guys, Eldad and Medad, that are acting as prophets? And Moshe said to them, he says, are you zealous on my account? Would it be, he says, would it be that all of Hashem's people were prophets and Hashem put his spirit upon them? So it's pretty explicit. He's basically saying, Lechachila, everybody would be a prophet. But the reality is that not all of us are so inspired, not all of us will be prophets. And so b'diavad, we need the institution of prophecy. Okay, so that's a second example. So now let's give a third example. So this is priesthood, kehunah. Kehunah is b'diavad. So this we see in Shemot. It says, this is after the story of the golden calf, and Moshe stands up and he famously says, Mi laHashem elai. Whoever is for Hashem, let him come and rally around me. And the only people that step up are the tribe of Levi. And they step up and they join Moshe. And then at the end, if you see in the last pasuk there, it says, Vayomer Moshe mil'u yedechem hayom laHashem ki ish bivno ve'achiv v'latet alechem hayom baracha. Dedicate yourselves today. Today, basically, you became special. And I will admit, it's a little bit vague in the text, and I brought the Malbim which is obviously a relatively late commentary, but he does, I think, defines very clearly what's going on here. Which he says, Moshe informed them that on the account of this, they would be consecrated to serve in the place of the firstborn who failed to rally around him, as B'nai Levi did. Okay, so what that means is that in some prior, state, we're told, the firstborns, the Bechorim of every family, were effectively the priests of the family, and that's the way that it could have been. But starting with the story of the golden calf and onward, where it's clear that the Bechorim, that the family-based system of passing on proper teaching and proper behavior and acting as the priest was not successful. From then onward, we have basically a professional priestly class, you would say, right? You have a group of people who will take on that role. But again, I bring it here because I think it's super interesting that it appears that in some lechatchila world, you wouldn't necessarily have had to have Kohanim as a separate group, a hereditary caste of people to take on that role. It could have been on a family by family basis, but b'diavad, that is what turned out to be perhaps not optimal, but certainly very good, a very good system and worthy of being celebrated because, again, in the real world, it works. In some theoretical optimal world, maybe you wouldn't have needed it, but in the real world, that a dispersed system like that doesn't seem to work, and we do need something more ordered. Okay, so that is on priesthood. Okay, next, this one is I would say on the more I guess one of the more controversial ones, but I think it's also worth just thinking about. So perhaps sacrifice is b'diavad. So this is one of the more famous and controversial claims that Rambam writes in Mor Nevuchim, and he quotes a line from Shemot that says, "Vayhi b'shalach paro et ha'am, v'lo nacham Elohim derech eretz plishtim ki karovhu, ki amar Elohim pen yinachem ha'am birotam milchama v'shav Mitzrayim." So when Paro let the people go, God didn't lead them the quickest path to get to Israel, the land of Israel, which would have been to go up the coast through the land of the Plishtim. But instead, God took them a more circuitous route. So the question is why? And the Pasuk answers by saying that basically God said that people are not ready to go direct to the land. They would have to go through the land of the Plishtim. They would have to basically come out of slavery and enter war on the coastal route, and they're just not ready for that. And so I'll take them in a more indirect route that gets them to the same place, even though it's a bit more circuitous. So that line, Rambam in this, again, famous and controversial section of the guide, says that let's use this to make an analogy. He says prayer is a more direct way to relate to God. Sacrifice is a more circuitous route, perhaps less ideal. So why didn't God just give us the direct path? Why didn't God just say, use prayer? Why have animal sacrifice at all? Rambam considers that perhaps the reason is that in the reality of the world of biblical times, at least, for the people who this would have applied to leaving Egypt, it would have been way too jarring to tell the people to give up the practice of sacrifice altogether. That would have been a bridge too far. And so instead, God gave to Bnei Israel a sacrificial system, but fenced it off, only in a centralized place, only with a restricted group of people leading it, the Kohanim. Okay, so again, it's less important whether this is not a consensus view, but I think it's very powerful that in the Jewish tradition, we seem to be very open to this idea of looking at things that are very central. They're laws of the Torah, they're very central to who we are, and saying we're open to the idea that maybe there is a lechatchila b'diavad dynamic going on. And what the Rambam would be saying is in a lechatchila world, maybe the Jewish slaves who left Egypt should have been ready to take on prayer as their primary way of approaching God. But the world is not lechatchila. That is not the actual world. in the real world, at least of the times, Bnei Israel needed a sacrificial system in order to relate to God. And that's an important point, that we don't live in some ideal but not realizable world. The Torah speaks in the language of people. It speaks to us in the real world as it is. Okay, so that's that example. Perhaps sacrifices B'diavad. Okay, let's take another example. This is the writing down of the Mishnah and the Gemara was B'diavad. Okay, Torah Sheba'al Peh was not meant to be written down, and the source 11 is the Gemara and Tamura, which reflects on this. It tells a story of Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish that wrote down certain elements of Torah Sheba'al Peh. And the Gemara's question is, how could they have done this? How is it possible that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish would have written down aspects of Torah Sheba'al Peh? And so it quotes a line, this is underlined, it quotes a line from Tehillim that says, Et lasot lashem, hafru Toratecha. So that's the line from Tehillim that says a time to do something for God because they have made void your Torah. And the interpretation is, Amri, we say, Mutav tiaker Torah ve'al tishkach Torah Misrael. Better to uproot the Torah, or you might say to uproot one rule of the Torah in order to preserve the rest of the Torah, that the rest of the Torah should not be forgotten. So basically, better to break the rule that the oral law should not be written down in order to preserve the memory and the vibrancy and just the existence of the Torah as a whole. Okay, so again, just to put it in the language we've been using of B'diavad and Lechatchila, it's not ideal that the Torah law should have been written. In fact, in this case, it's directly prohibited that the Torah Sheba'al Peh should have been written at all. But B'diavad, in the real world in which we live, it's much better to have the oral Torah written and to have it available to us than to have it forgotten entirely. So thank God, again, this is one of the key points. Thank God for B'diavad, right? It's not ideal, it's not perfect, but it is worthy of our acknowledgement and appreciation. Okay, one more. This one is actually, I'm not going to go through a text on it, but it's interesting to think about. All right, unshare. So this one's just kind of interesting to think about. So perhaps the existence of the Jewish people is B'diavad. Okay, so it's if you think about the early stories of Breshit, God creates the world first without Jews at all. There was an entire world that existed before the flood. There are 20 generations of people that lived before Abraham shows up on the scene, and it takes time for all of this to evolve. What was that all about? So obviously there are many explanations for this. I'm not trying to give an authoritative one, but one way to think about that is that God tries at first to address all of mankind in the same way, because after all, we're all made in the image of God. But that approach shows itself not to work. Before the flood, the first
time if you touch it, you're not going on a drive today. Did you hear what I said?
So again, the first generations prior to the flood, they are all addressed by God as one, but it doesn't work out. It ends with violence, with the flood, and with destruction. The next set of generations that follow the flood, again, everybody is kind of equal before God, and they end with, you would say, I guess one way to think about it is like kind of an oppressive uniformity. I think that's, the simplest meaning of the Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babel story, that they have the people all enforce upon themselves one language, one people, and the way that God kind of reacts to that is by separating them into a multiplicity of peoples with a multiplicity of languages. God basically disapproves of that kind of oppressive uniformity. But the point is that after 20 generations of mankind, when the day of Abraham comes around, God tries a new way, and that is, instead of addressing all people equally in the same exact way, God will have a unique relationship with a certain people. That's Bnei Israel, or children of Abraham, and then eventually Bnei Israel. And through them, God will have impact on all of mankind. So you might say, again, this is just a thought to consider, you might say, lechatchila, it would be great if everybody was just able to have the same unique relationship, or I guess not unique, each person each people would have the same direct relationship with God. Because again, after all, we're all equally children of God. But in our actual world, in our actual imperfect B'diavad world, the Torah tells us that it actually works better for there to be a certain division of labor. And I think the same theme also comes up in the famous Midrash, where God goes and offers the Torah to all the peoples, to many peoples before he offered it to Bnei Israel. I think one of the messages that comes away from that is there is some certain theoretical and maybe even optimal world in which everybody would have said yes to that offer. But in the real world, as it is, that just isn't how it goes. And so it's upon us to take on the special, not just 7 commandments, but 613 commandments and to play a special role in the world. Okay, so perhaps the existence of the Jewish people is in some way B'diavad. Okay, then let's do one more, because this one is the most unbelievable one, which I love. Okay, so this is perhaps the existence of mankind is B'diavad. So this is a famous Gemara from Eruvin, where it says, Tanu Rabbanan. I'll just read through it quickly. So it says, Tanu Rabbanan, for 2.5 years, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed. They argued. Okay, one side said it would have been better had man not been created at all than to have been created, and the other side said it would be preferable for man to have been created than not to have been created. So this is amazing. For 2.5 years, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel debated whether it is lechatchila, whether it is ideal, whether it's even better at all for mankind to have been created in the first place, or whether it would have been better for mankind to never have been created at all. And ultimately, it's amazing. It says that they voted on it, right? It says they were counted and concluded. It's like, it must be Nimnu V'Gamru. So Nimnu V'Gamru, they made a vote, and they determined that it's preferable. It would have been preferable had man not been created than been created. However, now that he's been created, you should examine your actions. And so, anyways, the point, there's a lot of layers to this, but I'm trying to, take a step back. So the message seems to be that at least the Gemara considers the possibility. It's actually the conclusion of the Gemara, amazingly. May have to, sorry, if anybody needs to mute. So maybe it's possible that in some lechatchila sense, in some ideal sense, it's hard for us to fathom, maybe it seems they voted and agreed it would have been better had mankind not been created at all. But in the B'diavad, imperfect world that we live in, where mankind has been created, then we should make the best of it. And we should basically look at our actions and do the best that we can. Okay, so that is section 1 of the shiur, right? Let's just review, a little recap. It's an amazing list of things where our tradition either says that something that we take for granted either is or might be B'diavad, suboptimal, imperfect, but nonetheless of value and worth recognizing. And that list is incredible. So it's the king, it's the prophet, it's the priesthood, perhaps the sacrificial system, the writing of the Mishnah and the Gemara, perhaps the existence of the Jewish people, perhaps the existence of mankind as a whole. It's just an unbelievable list. So that is part 1, the depth of the concept of B'diavad in our tradition. Okay, let me stop share for a second. Okay, part 2. So part 2 is the word B'diavad. Let's spend some time looking at the word itself and the way that it's used. So the word B'diavad never appears in the Torah. It actually doesn't appear in the Mishnah. The word lechatchila does appear in the Mishnah 5 times, but even there, it doesn't mean what we're talking about. It doesn't mean this concept of optimal, the way it should have been done up front. I'm actually gonna run through this quick, but just to show what I mean by that. This is a Mishnah from Masechet Shabbat, which basically talks about so it says a woman may weight her cloak with a stone, a nut, or a coin, providing that she does not attach the weight in the first place on Shabbat. So this is highly technical, but basically what it says is if a woman has a coat and she has something that's used to weigh it down, then when she walks outside with that on Shabbat, the question is that weight, is she carrying it or is she wearing it? Okay, if it's serving a function as part of the clothing, then she's wearing it. If it's just attached, then it's more like carrying it. Okay, and so anyways, I go through this only because what it says, ubilvad shelo tifrof lechachila b'Shabbat. It says it's okay for her to wear this weight as long as she doesn't lechatchila, she doesn't place the weight lechatchila b'Shabbat. As long as she doesn't place the weight, maybe you would translate that as in the first instance. Here it's actually, the translation is in the first place. Okay, but clearly the meaning is very different than what we're talking about, lechatchila as optimal and ideal. It's more literally like up front, right? And so again, this is just to kind of prove the point that again, b'diavad doesn't play a role in the Mishnah, and lechatchila doesn't, and the term lechatchila doesn't in the way that we mean it. Okay, but once we get to the Gemara, then we start to see the words lechatchila and b'diavad emerge. Though even there, it's very interesting. I thought this was fascinating that it's typically you'll see it in kind of the voice of the Gemara using that terminology, or in the later generations of the Amoraim, of the later generations of the rabbis of the times of the Gemara. And there's a very beautiful example that I think captures this. This is the beginning of Masechet Chulin. So let's just go through this. So the first Mishnah in Chulin begins. It says Hakol shochtin, anybody can shecht, can ritually slaughter, v'shchitatan kshera, and their slaughtering is kosher. And then it gives a bunch of provisos. What if it's a child? What if it's, what if it's someone who needs special oversight? But the first line is Hakol shochtin, anybody can shecht, v'shchitatan kshera. So that when you go to the Gemara asks it's a very fascinating phrasing. So let's look at the Gemara. It says Hakol shochtin lechatchila. Anybody can shecht, and again, this is the kind of the anonymous voice of the Gemara asking the question. It seems that there's a contradiction. Hakol shochtin lechatchila. Anybody can shecht. What the Gemara is saying here is it sounds like that means lechatchila. It sounds like what the Mishnah means to say is anybody can shecht lechatchila. And then it says ushchitatan kshera, and their slaughtering is kosher. And then the Gemara adds diavad, right? So meaning that the Gemara is basically asking, based on a terminology that doesn't show up in the Mishnah, the Gemara is basically asking this question: doesn't the Mishnah, if the Mishnah was going to use the words lechatchila and b'diavad, wouldn't it be saying Hakol shochtin lechatchila, right? Anybody can slaughter, meaning it's fine, it's truly fine, it's truly, absolutely fine for anybody to shecht? Or is it saying the language that sounds more b'diavad, that if you already slaughtered, then it's okay, kind of after the fact, if you already did it? And the Gemara follows up with the conversation that says Amar le Rav Acha Barei de Rava le Rav Ashi v'chol hakol lechachilahu. So Rav Acha, the son of Rabba, sister of Ashi, and again these are the latest generations of the Gemara, say, and is it true that every time the Mishnah uses the word hakol, what it's saying is lechachila, this is okay? So hopefully that wasn't too technical, but what I'm trying to get across is that I think it's very, very interesting that you have this language of lechatchila and b'diavad, which again are not easy words, right? They're not, lechatchila is a little easier to understand, but b'diavad is a much more complicated concept. And the point is not that the Mishnah didn't have that concept, because we've seen that the concept of b'diavad is extremely deep in our tradition. So it's not that, it's not even that the Mishnah, the halakha didn't have that concept. It's that the language it's the word bediavad and the word lechatchila just took some time to kind of come on the scene. And I think that's just very, very interesting, because it's not, the point of this history lesson, again, isn't to say that these concepts are new, but it's to show that the language didn't always exist necessarily, and that by the time we get to later generations, the Rishonim and onward, it's hard for us to even imagine discussing halacha without using the words bediavad and lechatchila. It just seems obvious that you would need those words to have a halachic conversation, but they don't show up in earlier sources. So by the time you get to the Shulchan Aruch, the word bediavad is used well over 100 times. And so I guess the message, or kind of to recap, is that we have this unique term, this hard to translate term, bediavad, which we saw needs suboptimal, but still meritorious, still valuable. And we've seen that concept runs very deep in our tradition, but that the language of describing it is probably something that took time to emerge, because I would say it's important, but not obvious. Okay, so that's kind of part two. The word bediavad, a little bit of a history of it, and hopefully getting across that it's something to be appreciated, that it's something that even having the terminology to be able to describe this important concept is something valuable, not obvious, that has kind of emerged. Okay, and that leads into part three of this year, which is, why is this concept of bediavad so important? You know, when I'm saying that this is maybe the secret sauce of Jewish success, so why? It's deep in our tradition. It's not an obvious concept that would just show up on its own if it didn't emerge. Why is it so important? Okay, so I think there are a few reasons. One is that Judaism is a religion of impossibly high expectations. So when the Torah says that we'll be a mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh, right, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, it gives us a sense that God has high expectations for us. And Jews are, in fact, held to a higher standard than most people are held to, right? And that brings out excellence. So we don't have just 7 mitzvot of Bnei Noach, which are basically just the basics of a healthy society that everybody is expected to live up to. We have 613 mitzvot. We have a lot more put upon us. And beyond just the dictates of halacha, the culture of Judaism, I would say, involves holding ourselves and the societies that we live in to a very, very high standard. And that's what the prophets did, right? They rebuked kings and they rebuked regular people for failing to live up, not just to the letter of the law, but to the spirit of the law. And I think that this concept of bediavad is important, because you can only ask the world of people if you're also able to have a concept that gives people credit for being less than perfect. And that's really where the concept of bediavad comes in. Because if you don't have it, then all you have is a very harsh dichotomy between, on the one hand, lechatchila, optimal, what you're supposed to do up front, or failure, right? And if you don't, and what bediavad has is a bridge. It's kind of this striving imperfection. And just so that we don't take it for granted, I think it's worth actually thinking about some other potential religious worldviews, because I would not say that this concept of bediavad is deeply ingrained in every world religion. And so I hope you'll pardon me, it's not typical to have the Apostle Paul in your Mari Mikamot, but I think there's an incredible line where Paul says the following. He says, "Cursed is everyone who does not observe and obey all the things written in the book of the law." He says, "For all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. And it's evident that no one is justified before God by the law." Okay, so what Paul's basically saying is, he's basically saying that the law, the halakha, the expectations of the Torah are a setup, because everybody fails. It's a standard that no one can live up to. And so everybody under the law is cursed. And so the solution is to not be under the law. The solution is to not have a binding set of laws upon you as your path towards God. And for Paul and for Christianity that he's preaching, faith alone is the path to salvation. Okay, so I would argue that Paul didn't internalize the Jewish concept of b'diavad, that we actually value effortful imperfection, that failure to live up to the law does not put a curse on you. And it's worth quoting the line from Rabbi Tarfon is quoted as saying in Pirkei Avot, right? Lo alecha ha'melacha ligmor, velo ata ben chorin libatel mimena. That's like within 100 years of Paul's time, right? And the Jewish line basically says it's not upon you to finish the work, but you're not able to just neglect your duty, or you have to basically try your best. What Paul is saying is your best equals failure, and so it better not to try, right? And so I think gives a nice example of why the concept of b'diavad is so important. Okay, now this concept of high expectations is a double-edged sword. In that, I'm just going to pull this line from, this is the Rambam. He says in Hilchot Shuvah, he says, I'm just going to read it in English. It's therefore necessary for every man to behold himself throughout the whole year in light of being evenly balanced between innocence and guilt, and to look upon the entire world as if evenly balanced between innocence and guilt. Thus, if he commits one sin, he'll overbalance himself and the whole world to the side of guilt and be a cause of its destruction. But if he performs one duty, behold, one mitzvah, behold, he will overbalance himself and the whole world to the side of virtue and bring about his own and their salvation and escape. Okay, so this is the most extreme example that I could think of Judaism holding people to the highest possible standard, to the most, like this is the announcement of lechatchila. You should view every moment of your day as if every deed that you do, be it good or bad, the whole weight of the world and its future is on your shoulders, okay? That's an example of what it means to have high expectations put upon us, okay? But it's just important, I think, that there are some side effects, right? If this was the only part of the Jewish tradition, then we would be in trouble. Thankfully, we have that. We have the high expectations that leads to excellence, that leads to success beyond any other group. But we also have the means through this concept of b'diavad of dealing with not always achieving that level of excellence. And so I think there are some side effects, right? There is this kind of Jewish guilt concept, which you could see where that comes from. And I would say that maybe is with an overstressing of lechatchila without a proper appreciation of the value and importance of b'diavad. But anyways, I think it's not just a Jewish thing. I think it's also something that in our contemporary culture is kind of hard to get across. I think that these days you might say that there are some camps that reject high standards as oppressive, right? And that's something that is not a Jewish way of thinking about it. We don't reject high standards as oppressive. We think of them as empowering. And I think also there are some aspects of our contemporary culture that have this kind of absolutist kind of moralism, that lacks a sense of forgiveness for people who aren't in complete compliance. And I think that's really, again, what b'diavad is about. So basically, just to recap that broad point, Judaism is a religion of impossibly high expectations, and that's enabled and empowered by the forgiveness that's kind of embedded in this concept of b'diavad. Okay, so that's one important aspect of why I love b'diavad. Okay, second. So a religion that's willing to view so much of itself, as we've seen, as b'diavad, right? And we saw that in that long list of things that we hold dear, and it's not to make light of them. They are important things, but we view them not necessarily as being utopian and ideal. We view them as being something that is true for the real imperfect world as it is, okay? So I think that willingness to view things in that light creates a culture of constant questioning and people not being complacent, right? And so this, I think, is important, right? Because Marx obviously called religion the opium of the masses. Hinduism is related, you know, and kind of supports a caste system. Anyways, the list goes on, right? That kind of Plato had this idea of a noble lie, that you should sort of make up a religion to tell people that they should stay in line, more or less. Bottom line is that the Torah's message is that the status quo is not necessarily ideal. The status quo in so many respects is something that is very much bediavad, and where we can continue to aspire to something that is lechatchila. And I love this quote from Rabbi Sachs, who obviously sadly passed away recently. This quote from Rabbi Sachs, he said, "Judaism was and remains the world's great religion of protest. The heroes of faith did not accept, they protested. They were willing to confront God himself. Abraham said, 'Shall the judge of all earth not do justice?' Moses said, 'Why have you done evil to this people?' Jeremiah said, 'Why are the wicked at ease?' That's how God wants us to respond. Judaism is God's call to human responsibility. The highest achievement is to become God's partner in the work of creation." So that's much more nicely said than I ever could. I would just say Judaism is a religion that says never be complacent. It's a culture of constant questioning and probing and improving. And so that's why it's not surprising that Jews have driven so many of the world's great innovations, because our culture is constantly pushing us to look at the world as it is and wonder whether some of the things that we take for granted are actually just bediavad. They're suboptimal. They might be good enough, but maybe we should be striving for something more. So, okay, this is kind of like, to sum up the second why I love bediavad, why bediavad is important. I think it's part of a culture of, you know, one, we saw impossibly high expectations, but secondly, a culture of questioning and constant search for improvement. Okay, and then the third thing that I think is important about the fact that we can recognize so many things as being bediavad is that it allows for tremendous flexibility and adaptability. So it's very easy to see that Jewish history is highly bediavad. Jewish history is highly suboptimal. We've been through a lot. And yet there's an amazing ability for us to look at reality as it is and to make the best of it and to make things that are in fact bediavad into something that is valuable and vibrant. So the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed. We move on to having our center of our community around shuls and prayer. We're not shattered if we cannot be perfect, right? There's no Sanhedrin. These days we have a distributed legal system. There's no central leadership, but it actually turns out that we have an organic style of leadership that tends to work fairly well. So I think this concept of flexibility and adaptability only works because we have this ability to look at things even as they were and say, it's not a utopia. It's not lechatchila. You know, we are constantly striving to make the best of the world as it actually is. And that kind of, it's a religion of this world, right? It's not a religion of utopia as the world, you know, lost in the dream of what the world might be. It's a religion that is focused on making the best of the world and making the best of us as we are in the world that we actually live in. So, okay, so I'm just going to sum up. I think we've kind of been, you know, running. I don't want to run too late. So let me recap where we've been. So we looked at the history of the concept of bediavad, in its broadest sense in Jewish tradition, and we saw a shocking range of things where Jewish tradition reflects on aspects of our lives and of the world and sees them not as ideal, but as important and striving to make the best of an imperfect situation. We saw the king, the prophet, Leviim and Kohanim, the priesthood, sacrifice, the writing of the Mishnah, the existence of the Jewish people, the existence of humanity. Okay, that was part one. Part two, as we said, let's look at the word bediavad. And we saw that it's a crucial halachic term. It's so important for the way that we describe halacha as it is, but it's also not an obvious term. It's not a term that was always used. And so I think that's also an important point. The point is that this is a complicated, it's a complicated concept, and that I think that hopefully I got across that I think should lead us to a greater appreciation of it. And then finally, we reflected on certain ways how a culture that has this strong sense of valuing imperfection has amazing strengths, right? It's a culture of high expectations, but with forgiveness of our imperfections, of our inability to always meet that standard. It's a culture that's never complacent, that doesn't assume that the way things are the way that they necessarily ought to be. And it's a religion and a culture that is incredibly flexible and adaptable and allows us to deal with the very bedieved aspects of Jewish history. Okay, so with all that, I will end with a Gemara that I think really captures in just a beautiful, beautiful way what the meaning of this word bedieved is, and all the concepts that we were talking through. Okay, so we're just going to do this last source. So this is a Gemara from Masechet Pesachim. It says, so let's go to the second line. It says, Hatida Kadosh Baruch Hu la'asot seuda letzadikim beyom shigamel chasdo lezaro shel Yitzchak. So in the future, God will make a great meal, a great banquet for the tzaddikim. It's amazing in the future, basically like in messianic times, right? There will be an amazing banquet of tzaddikim. And then it says, Le'achar shochlim v'shotim, after they're done eating and drinking, notnin lo la'Avraham Avinu koshel bracha levarech. The question is, who's going to bench at the end of this amazing banquet of the tzaddikim in days to come? Who's going to bench? So first, we go to Avraham. And Avraham says, no, I can't do it because I had Yishmael. So I can't lead. I'm not worthy to lead the benching. So they go to Yitzchak and they say, Yitzchak, okay, here's the cup, you bench. And he says, no, I can't bench because I also had a son who was unworthy. I had Esav. So then they go to Yaakov and they say, okay, time for you to bench. And he says, no, I married 2 wives who were alive at the same time. This is an amazing line. She'atida Torah le'osran alai. That in the future, the Torah will make this illegal. So it's amazing. In his day, there was no Torah, right? It was not illegal for him to do it. But the fact that later on, this would become against the law, basically, he says, I can't do it. I'm not the man for you to bench. So then they go to Moshe and they say, Moshe, you bench. And he says, no, I can't bench. He says, Shelo zachiti likanes le'eretz Yisrael, lo b'chayai v'lo b'moti. He says, I can't bench because I didn't merit to go to the land, to enter the land of Israel, neither in my lifetime or even after death. I guess in contrast, Yaakov was brought after death, and Yosef is brought after death. So, okay, so Moshe, he says, I don't qualify. Then they go to Yeshua. Yeshua says, no, I can't do it. I didn't have any sons. They're like, oh man, who's going to bench? So finally, the last line, they go to David and they say, why don't you bench? And he says, Ani avarech, I will bench, velina elavarech. And it's fitting for me to bench. And Amar kos Yeshua tesav Hashem Hashem ekra. And he quotes a line from Tehillim. Okay, so this is like I think a beautiful example of how the rabbis use a story to get across a very deep message. So as you go through it, right, it's you go through each of the avot, and you say, wow, this is the days of perfection. This is the days to come, and you're at the greatest banquet of tzaddikim. Any one of these people is worthy to bench. And one by one, they all say, no, I'm not worthy. And when you look at the reasons that they give for why they're not worthy, you start to realize that it's a farce, right? The reasons that they're giving are holding themselves up to such an impossible standard of perfection that you start to realize that those reasons are not good reasons not to lead the benching. And then at the very end, the cup goes to David HaMelech, and David HaMelech has obvious reasons of all on the list why he shouldn't bench. He's the one whose flaws are the most forward in Tanakh, right? He's the one who sees a beautiful woman on a rooftop and leads a loyal officer to his death, and who's told off by the prophet Natan and says in the end, I stand guilty before God, right? So David HaMelech, all on the list, would have had an easy out, let's say, compared to the other ones, and yet he's the one who steps up and he says, it's proper for me to lead. And so I think the takeaway is that David's striving imperfection outshines his peers, who are in this story depicted as paralyzed by even their own slightest faults. And that, again, is the concept of bediavad that we've been talking about. It's a Hebrew word which is so hard to translate into English, but our culture and our legal system incorporates, I'd say, the synthesis of two important elements. One, the pursuit of impossibly lofty goals, and two, a willingness to forgive ourselves for our blemishes and not be crippled by them. So with that, I really appreciate everybody joining. I hope you enjoyed. I hope that this will be a good memorial for my grandfather, who was really a fantastic man.